Business and Supply Chain Management here at University of Tennessee in our College of Business, and the lead faculty in supply chain management. We offer programs all the way from undergraduate through MBA and PhD, and also some non-degree programs in business processes around supply chain. I welcome you all here. I see several familiar names out there, so it's great to see your names. Hopefully you'll have some good questions for me. Anastasia Loboda has asked me to make some comments about some research that myself and three co-authors have been engaged in that has really formed the basis of our global curriculum in the Global Supply Chain Executive MBA program here at UT, which is currently in its first and inaugural year. I will tell you a little bit more about that program later on during this webinar. But before I did that, I just wanted to share some information about the research endeavor that my three co-authors, and I'll introduce you to them right now. They're not here, but Mandyam Srinivasan is one of our faculty members here at UT in Operations Management. Ken Peterson is one of our supply chain professors with an expertise in procurement here at UT. And Philippe Pierre Dornier is our partner and lead supply chain faculty at SCM College of Business in Paris and Singapore. They are also partners with us in the Global Supply Chain EMBA, the SCM is, and all four of the authors on the book, myself included, are core faculty in the Global Supply Chain EMBA program. So this has been a book that has tied in pretty well with our endeavors in launching the EMBA program. What the book is about is in our travels around our different business contacts, we discovered that there was a lack of knowledge and a ready-handed manual to provide business managers with insights into how to make better decisions in the global supply chain environment. In fact, too often what we found in business was that global business decisions were made by other areas of the firm, generally about what markets we were going into, what manufacturing, outsourcing, or offshoring decisions we were going to make, generally based on low labor cost, sourcing decisions based on lowest procurement cost or purchase price variance, that often threw broader supply chain managers into a mode where they were reacting to what the global network was and trying to optimize within some pretty heavy constraints, and being forced to make decisions without all the information that they needed. In fact, we've called it, if you'll advance the slide, please, Anastasia. What we've called it is an attempt for us to provide information so that managers can know before they go, because in most cases, managers were sent overseas based on supply chain decisions and had to learn on the job, if you will. And so what we've tried to do is provide information in one source book that provides deep knowledge about various elements of a nation within a region so that supply chain managers have a base knowledge of some pretty key variables that impact the supply chain before they either go to run operations or before they make decisions about setting up operations in a global environment. If you'll go back one slide, I do want to introduce our agenda to folks. I'm going to give just some high-level insights on the global supply chain decision-making realm, and then talk about some general trends within global supply chain management, introduce you to the EPIC framework, which is our framework that we've used for assessing 9 regions of the globe and 55 countries in economics, politics, infrastructure, and competence. I'll share with you some high-level findings, and then we'll have a brief conversation about the Global Supply Chain EMBA. At that point, we'll open it up for some questions. That'll be about 20 minutes into this webinar. We'll open it up for some questions, and after about 8 minutes of questions, I'll give you some details on our next webinar, and then we'll wrap it up and let you all get back to work. Okay. One question did come up in advance, and that was whether these slides will be available. We will make these slides available to you and provide you with the information at the end of the webinar. So next slide, please. So what are some of the trends that are impacting global supply chain management? Most of us are familiar with them. There's clearly heightened cost pressures, and so attempts have been made to look globally for lower unit cost items in procurement, for lower labor cost in manufacturing, for lower capital costs for facilities. So that heightened cost pressure has put most organizations into a global environment. In fact, I tell my students here at University of Tennessee that even if they're from a small town in the USA, there's the chance that most companies in their small town are involved in global business, either from where they get their materials from, or perhaps some are even selling to global customers in an online basis. With that global perspective comes a heightened consumer expectation that we're going to get things to them in shorter and shorter time frames. And any company that competes in online consumer business knows the trends that are being driven by companies like Amazon for same-day delivery when you make an online purchase, for example. That's a reality. There's increased requirements for coordination when we go into any supply chain environment, but particularly in the global environment where lead times are longer, distances are longer, and so we have to have enhanced coordination between those partners so that we don't have excessive supply chain pipelines. We understand that there's increased risk of disruption, something we certainly have to consider when we engage in the supply chain environment. We have to look in increasingly different areas for sourcing, particularly for things like rare earth metals and other scarce materials that force us into areas that we may not have a lot of knowledge of, and there may not be very well established infrastructures for trade. Every country has different rules and government regulations for operating within the country, for trade and tariffs, and that's something that has often challenged our knowledge base as we go global. And finally, different regions of the world have different considerations and norms when it comes to environmental concerns and sustainability. And supply chain managers need to be aware of those differences as they look to set operations around the world. Next slide. So what we ended up creating after some exhaustive research of different databases and different research that was done was a framework to help us assess these different nations on four main dimensions. The first one being the economy, the resources of a country in terms of its production and consumption of goods and services. In their politics, the means by which state policy is enforced and the mechanism for ruling and governing all aspects of a society, including business. The basic infrastructure, the tangible elements of transportation, power provision and utilities, and telecommunications, which are increasingly important in today's global environment. And finally, business competencies within a nation. What are the standards for availability of labor? What are education levels? What language are we all going to talk to each other in? What is the nature of support industries for supply chain, like the logistics industry in a country? So those are issues in business competencies. In these next few slides, I'm just going to give you a little bit of detail about the specific metrics that we looked at within each of these four major dimensions of economy, politics, infrastructure, and competence. First of all, in the economy, we looked at things like economic output and growth rates, tax rates, labor costs, population trends, demographics, where are people moving, what's the level of urbanization, what is the level of foreign direct investment, how does the financial community consider this nation in terms of an investment risk, exchange rate stability, inflation. What's the trade status in that nation? Is it a trade nation or is trade relatively new? In politics, we looked at the legal and regulatory framework. What are the laws? What's the Constitution? How easy is it to do business if I need to get a license to set up a business? Hiring and firing practices fall within ease of doing business. I've had a number of international business colleagues tell me how difficult it is if they have an employee that is not doing the job to get rid of an employee in some environments. Political stability. What is the nature of the political environment, and is it at risk of uncertainty and turnover? Next one. In infrastructure, as I mentioned, we looked at the physical infrastructure for transportation, port facilities, airports, land transportation, utilities in terms of power and water provision, and telecommunications, internet, mobile phone connectivity, etc. And finally, in competence, we looked at issues related to labor, availability, productivity rates, what's the relationship between management and labor, what are the educational levels for both line and for management, and finally, the logistics, customs, and security apparatus that exist in the nation. Just to quickly give you some insights into some of the data that we found, I'm not going to go deeply into these. A, because it's pretty complex, and B, because we don't necessarily have the time. But this is an overview of both global gross domestic product in terms of the size of those yellow circles that you can see. And then also the color coding is human development. So it gives you a sense of not only the economic status in an area, but also the labor and human resource availabilities. And you'll see that in areas that are relatively mature from an economic standpoint, there's also significant maturity in the development of their labor and capital. So if we're going to different areas, the challenge is, what are those business competencies in labor going to be? Next slide. This just shows you some of the political risk. A lot of the areas that we recognize as growing consumer markets happen to be areas that have relatively high political risk. How does that play into our decisions in terms of establishing supply chain networks and operations to manage and try to attempt to get business in those consumer marketplaces, or to get raw material sourcing or manufacturing sourcing in those areas? Next slide. This is the World Road Network. I just thought from this perspective it was very interesting to see the parts of the world where we have relative intensity in terms of being able to move product, and parts of the world that are relatively sparse. Notice South America over to the right-hand side of our slide. All that discussion about Brazil being one of the great emerging consumer markets, and it is, but think about moving product through Brazil. It's relatively difficult from a land movement standpoint, and we need to be knowledgeable about that. Finally, this is ease of doing business, with the darker colors being areas that are much more difficult to do business because of political rules and regulations, cultural norms, etc. And again, notice that a lot of the areas that we're thinking about as potential areas for either raw material procurement, sub-assemblies, manufacturing offshoring, or consumer markets for finished goods are all mainly areas where there's large challenges in doing business. And so it sets up a juxtaposition that we saw throughout our research, that the most promising areas for supply chain opportunities are also the most challenging to running efficient and effective supply chains. So let me just share some basic findings with you. One thing that we saw is that 9 global regions, and I'll quickly run through those regions for you. They're East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Western Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, North and Central America, and South America were the 9 regions that we looked at. Within each of those regions, we found significant supply chain opportunities for both sourcing, manufacturing, and consumer markets, but also significant challenges related to economics, related to politics, infrastructural challenges, or business competency challenges. We learned that these decisions are highly complex, and to make them based on a simplistic assumption or on only one variable, for example, purchase price variance or labor cost, is extremely naive and will result in hidden costs that will negatively impact your supply chains. There'll be a return of manufacturing to the Western Hemisphere to serve North and South American markets. That was something that we have seen the trend building during the 2.5 years we've worked on this book, and it's been supported by our research. The big question is, where will it go? And we think we've got some answers to that in our book. Trade lanes are going to change. There's going to be different logistics and value-added supply chain locations in places like increasingly Hong Kong, Singapore, the United Arab Emirates, Panama. Interesting areas that we may not have been ultimately familiar with in our trade lanes today, but are going to be growing in terms of global trade lanes. And finally, some interesting places that you may not have thought about before. Places like Panama and Costa Rica, Chile in South America, Central and Eastern European locations, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia, South Africa. A number of places in addition to those, but those are the main ones that we've found some interesting opportunities for supply chain operations. So let me take that conversation then into our Global Supply Chain Executive MBA program. The Global Supply Chain Executive MBA program is a 1-year program really focused on developing mid-level managers into senior level managers by providing them with an exposure to general MBA material in business, about 60% of our curriculum, and then also an exposure to global supply chain management curriculum, particularly for organizations that feel that they need leaders with global supply chain management knowledge. This program fits between a lot of other programs that are out there that either provide general management knowledge or very granular supply chain specifics, but not an MBA focus with a strategic view on global supply chain management. So again, it's a one-year program. It provides significant global immersion. Our students, during the course of our 1 year, will have courses on 3 different continents, shared with faculty from a broad array of different institutions around the globe. The curriculum is both supply chain and leadership development focused, and there's ample opportunities for applied learning. Most of our assignments, 90% of our assignments, are assignments that are focused on an organization that are designed for the student to take their learnings and apply them in their current work organization, so that we also provide value to the organization and immediate ROI. Next slide, please. There's also significant value to be gained by the organization. In fact, our target is to assign projects. One included is called the Organizational Action Project, that lasts the entire year and has a goal of generating $1 million plus in return on investment for the host organization that the student comes from. And our past experiences in executive MBA programs show us that we are able to achieve that number and higher. As I mentioned before, this program is offered with global partners. We have ESSEC College of Business in Paris and also a Singapore wing. We have Central European University in Budapest. And we also bring in faculty from another number of other institutions to provide content expertise in areas that our 3 partners and ourselves feel we need our students exposure to. It's a modular structure. Students join us for 2 weeks per quarter, so 4 different 2-week periods over the course of a year, with 2 of them being held in the United States, 1 of them being held in Europe, in a location in both Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and then 1 of them in Asia Pacific, 1 in China, and currently 1 in Singapore. In between our 2-week quarterly sessions, we also have a number of weekly distance learning sessions that are both asynchronous in terms of us putting out a video for students to view at their leisure, and then also synchronous sessions where we get together as a class and conduct interactive sessions. One of our huge goals for this program has been to establish collaborative learning. And what that means is that we don't view this as a one-way dialogue between our faculty and our students, but that students should be engaged in a multi-way conversation, not only with our global faculty, but with global business executives from around the world. In each of our global residency periods, we bring in local business managers to share their thoughts and expertise, and social networks with our students. The students themselves form a collaborative learning network. Our current student class consists of 17 students from a range of industries and companies that range across aerospace, energy, international healthcare, logistics and transportation industry, luxury consumer goods, food and beverage, and technology companies. Some of those companies include Boeing, Caterpillar, Dell, Johnson & Johnson, Mondelez International, which is former Kraft, Pilot Flying J, Kenco Logistics, which is a mid-range third-party logistics provider. And they come from a variety of geographic backgrounds. Of our 17 students, 4 of whom are women, 7 come from international bases of operation. The average student is 37 years old with 16 years of managerial experience. So your colleagues in your class are not inexperienced newbies, but rather very experienced pros that have deep knowledge in one area or another of the supply chain, but whose goal in seeking out this program is to both broaden their supply chain knowledge as well as provide them with the tools to take the next step to the corporate leadership level of their firm. I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes taking some questions from you. If anyone has any questions they'd like to submit. Okay, we have one question that's come up. This question is, what differentiates this program from other supply chain programs currently available? That's a great question, and I touched on it earlier. But as we set about creating this program, we looked at the competitive environment, if you will, for supply chain programs. And what we found was that there are a number of very deep Masters of Science programs in supply chain management that are available. And the goal of those programs are to take practitioners of supply chain management and to give them deeper analytical skills within their supply chain areas. Alternative to the supply chain programs was the executive MBA programs that tended to focus more on senior leadership development in general strategy areas. And what we found missing was an executive MBA program that both provided those senior leadership skills and executive type skill sets that students needed to move to the next level, focused on knowledge, strategic knowledge in global supply chain management for organizations that really believe global supply chain management to be a key differentiator for their own organizations in the future. Great question. Thank you. Other questions? Question here is, do you need to take the GMAT? The GMAT is by regulation and rule of our university graduate program required. However, it may be waived on the basis of work experience. Generally speaking, 10 to 7 years of work experience is ample opportunity for us to be able to make an argument with our graduate school to waive the GMAT, particularly if you already have another graduate degree. So it's really on a case-by-case basis, and it's based on both the educational and experiential background of the potential student. Another good question. Great question. Does UT offer online classes regarding global supply chain management and sourcing? I assume you mean in this case whether we offer non-degree programming in those areas. And UT does have a long history of non-degree programming in both global supply chain management and sourcing. At this point, we do not offer online programming. However, I can tell you that it is a major initiative for our university, and there's lots of conversations happening currently around the topic of offering online classes in the near future. So I guess I would have to tell you, Lee, to stay posted on that, and we'll get back with you. I talked about the makeup of our students with an average 37 years of age and 16 years of managerial experience. Question next is, can I be admitted if I have less than 10 years of managerial experience? Our feeling on that is that 10 years of managerial experience is a guideline. We feel that that is the level of experience that puts you as a student on an equal footing with other students in the class so that you can share your knowledges and gain from their knowledge. However, again, it is a guideline, and every student is considered individually in terms of those decisions. Other questions? Are there any questions about the book, Epic? I didn't share with you very many findings, deep findings, but I'm certainly open to questions on that. The book is under contract with McGraw-Hill and their financial press. If I had had hair, I would not have had hair over the last 3 weeks because our book is due to the publisher on June 30th, which is this Sunday, and we are putting final touches on all the chapters. So stay tuned on that, but you'll see significant marketing and promotional material coming both from us and from McGraw-Hill over the next few months about the availability of the book. Also, a question about whether it's possible to obtain a copy of the presentation. Absolutely. We will, at the completion of this webinar, direct your website to another location that will provide you with details on how to obtain a copy of the presentation. That will happen automatically, Anastasia tells me. Additional questions about where we can learn more about the Executive MBA program. First of all, I would encourage you to contact Anastasia. or David Eklund, whose email is on this final slide. David is the director of the Global Supply Chain MBA Program, and his email is there. Also, we do have a website. Anastasia, can you share me with that website? GlobalSupplyChainExecutiveMBA.com is the website that's available for you to get more information. Rob, thank you for asking that question. I have a question from Don. Can you expand on the environmental sustainability impact in the global supply chain? Yeah, that's been an interesting finding for us. As you might expect, rules and regulations around the world regarding environmental and sustainability issues are very different. However, in increasingly mature consumer markets, which by the way are still very attractive from a finished goods standpoint, we are finding increasing constraints in terms of environmental and sustainability regulations, particularly, for example, in Europe around the areas of carbon footprinting. And we expect over the course of the next 3 years that considerations in total cost models for environmental and sustainability issues will become increasingly important as we establish our global supply chain network designs and operations. That's true certainly in Europe. It's gaining far more attention in Asia than it has in the past, and again in North America, it's also increasing in attention. Of course, I always think the sustainability is also related to the petroleum issue, and one thing that we found is that from the time we set out to write this book 2.5 years ago till today, we've been shocked about what's happened with the global perspective on petroleum and oil energy products, mainly changed by the discovery and drilling technology breakthroughs in the oil sands in the northwestern U.S. and Canada, as well as discovery of deep water fields off of Africa and South America that are dramatically changing our projections on oil availability and sustainability of supply chains from that standpoint. Alejandro, how you doing, Alex? Regarding the EPIC framework, how much was technology or the maturity of technology in those regions taken into consideration? We looked at technology predominantly in the area of infrastructure and telecommunications, and that was one of the major pillars of our assessment grades for companies in the infrastructure area. As you might expect, there are areas of the world that are very attractive from a sourcing and/or manufacturing and/or finished goods marketplace that have extreme challenges in the area of telecommunications. There are other areas that you wouldn't expect to have sophisticated technology that have very good capabilities. For example, Egypt. Egypt is an area that has relatively weak infrastructure in a lot of areas, but has world-class telecommunications infrastructure. We're running out of time for questions. I'll take one more question, but also if you have further questions, please feel free to email either David or Anastasia, and we'll get those questions answered for you. Okay, it looks like we're running towards the end of our time. Again, I would emphasize that you can email for more questions if you need those answered. Also, I'd like to spend just a minute to tell you about the next webinar that we will host on July 17th, 2013, so a little bit less than a month from now at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And that webinar will focus on a recent report that we have published from University of Tennessee that looks at 10 game-changing trends. Actually, this is an interesting reflection back on game-changing trends that were identified over 10 years ago and were projected to be trends that dramatically changed the way we conducted supply chain operations throughout the years of the 2000s and into the 2010s. And what 10 researchers at University of Tennessee, myself included, did was look at those trends from a retrospective and where we are today to see how well we've actually achieved those projected results, where industry is today, and what some of the top issues are related to those trends and business practices that companies are using to address them. So it's pretty interesting. It's a 2000 to 2012 projection. And we've essentially done a state of the art, where are we now, where are we going next, and what are some of the best practices companies are using to deal with it. That's it. I'm signing off. It's good to see all the familiar faces.